atheists who like this form of the argument leave it out, and also because you could assimilate, if you're careful, you could assimilate the concept of divine omniscience to the concept of divine omnipotence, at least for the purposes of understanding the permission of evil. All right? So now the question is, can one consistently believe, that is, believe without contradiction, these three propositions? God is all-powerful, God is morally perfect, and evil exists. Evil is a reality. Let's take this argument and see what kind of response might be made. First of all, we need to ask, where exactly is the contradiction here? Where exactly is the contradiction? On the face of it, it's not immediately obvious that evil is incompatible with the existence of a morally perfect, omnipotent God. So in order for this to constitute a contradiction, believing these three things, then believing these three things must entail commitment to other assumptions that have not yet been made explicit. The idea would be that if God is all-powerful, He could prevent evil. There's the assumption. Back of the claim that omnipotence is problematic here, because omnipotence entails that God could prevent evil. And goodness entails that God would want to. That a morally perfect God would want to prevent all evil. So what we need to do is examine these assumptions and consider whether they're necessarily true. Let's take the assumption that an all-powerful God could prevent any and all evil. It seems that that would be true only on the condition that God does not create free creatures. Right? That would be true only on the assumption that God does not create free creatures, or on the condition that God does not create free creatures. But suppose God does create free creatures, human beings with freedom, genuine freedom, like you and I have, such that those creatures are able to make free decisions without external constraint by their conditioning or their environment or God Himself. Now, His power would not be limited by the fact that He created free creatures, because He would still be as powerful as He needs to be all-powerful, if that just means He can do everything that it is logically possible to do. But it wouldn't be logically possible, right, to support the real, genuine freedom of a free creature and yet make that creature do with his or her will what he wants. Now, God could determine the will of a being, if you want to call it the will of a being. If it's determined, in what sense is it the will of the being that's determined? You could thwart the will of a being and make that being act a certain way, but then that creature would not be free. So maybe this assumption that an all-powerful God would be able to prevent evil is itself false, unless He just decides not to create free creatures at all. And then the question is a world with free creatures who might sin or might do evil a better world or a worse world than a world with no free creatures at all? And it could be argued, I think, that these worlds are very difficult to compare morally. How do you compare a world with creatures who do not have moral properties because they do not have moral freedom, with a world where there are genuinely free creatures capable of moral responsibility and hence capable of morally good as well as morally bad acts? How would you compare them? How would you say that one was morally better than the other? And on what grounds would you prefer a world where there were no free creatures over a world where there are free creatures like yourself? So that's one problem with the logical argument from evil. It makes assumptions about the power of God that are themselves questionable. Now look at the assumption about God's goodness. Does the goodness of God entail that God could not will to permit any evil? And of course, the answer to that depends on whether God's permission of evil is for a greater good. In fact, we've already suggested that human freedom is itself a good, which justify God's risking the introduction of evil on the part of free creatures. So great is the good of human freedom that God creates free creatures and thereby establishes the real possibility that free creatures will sin, a possibility that God in His omniscience knows is going to be actualized. But why? Because of a greater good. So He will act for the good and for the greater good, but that doesn't mean that because He's morally perfect, He will act in order to prevent all evil, especially if some evils establish conditions for certain goods, like the good of human freedom. And in a little bit we'll talk about some other goods that may be made possible by God's permission of evil. Now this, in a nutshell, permits the conclusion that the logical argument from evil does not stand. There really is no logical contradiction between our three propositions. God is morally perfect, God is all-powerful, and yet evil exists. These three things can all be true without contradiction. Now, many of my students ask me, well, when you give a response like that to a famous argument from evil, what do atheists say in response? In this case, it's very interesting to note that contemporary atheistic philosophers, by and large, accept this evaluation of the argument. And they no longer endorse the logical argument from evil. Let me give you an example from this article that I said I would refer to by William Rowe. This article is titled "The Problem of Evil and Some Varieties of Atheism." And the focus of his argument is an argument of a rather different kind. But in the first footnote, which is on page 41 of this book, William Rowe says this: "Some philosophers have contended that the existence of evil is logically inconsistent with the existence of the theistic God." That's the logical argument from evil. Now, when he says some philosophers have made this claim, he doesn't clearly indicate how many in the past used to do this, and how many up until fairly recently used to do this. Perhaps most famously within our contemporary world, the now deceased atheist philosopher J.L. Mackie endorsed an argument of this kind in his book, The Miracle of Theism. He thought it was a miracle that anyone should believe that God exists, given the evidence against the existence of God. And not so many years ago, his book was published by Oxford University Press, in which he endorsed the logical argument from evil. I recently read an article by another philosopher, very sophisticated philosopher named Quentin Smith, in which he gives two arguments against the existence of God, and one of them is the logical argument from evil. So there are a few people today or recently who have claimed